Martin, thanks very much for making time to be with us this morning at the opening of Responsible Tourism at World Travel Market in 2020. Martin, you were for a long time responsible for dealing with crises in the travel and tourism industry. Do you want to just reflect perhaps on what you used to do and how it differs from the current situation?
Well, you're right. I spent 30 odd years actually trying to help the industry through different crises around the world. And I suppose it's true to say that most of those kind of crises were to some extent localized, and most of them were not actually necessarily going to go on very long. So it might have been a hurricane in the Caribbean. It might have been political problems in Southeast Asia. Various sorts of conflicts in Europe, earthquakes, floods, and so on. But all of them were relatively short in the memory of consumers. And as a result of which, because there is this huge underlying wish to go on away and to travel, actually tourism tends to recover very quickly. This situation of COVID is rather different because we expect it to go on probably for another year.
And I suppose you could argue, Martin, that this crisis this pandemic has to some extent been spread, to quite a large extent, been spread by international travel within the travel and tourism industry.
Yes, indeed. I remember some years ago, at the time of swine flu, going to the World Health Organization in Geneva and talking with them there and going through simulations about the impact. And it was quite clear that the industry has a huge role to play in the communication of diseases. It's not just the connectivity we make, it's actually the fact that we then import it elsewhere very quickly indeed. It is the prime source of movement. We need to take responsibility for that and understand that if we're going to get out of this, we've got to find a way of creating travel which does not import the disease into other countries.
What do you see as the best way of doing that, Martin? I mean, there are a number of people talking about treatment. There are hopes that we'll have an effective rapid test. But how do you see that moving forward? And what would be necessary to make it work internationally?
Well, it seems to me that the key to unlocking all of this is rapid testing. And at the moment, they are moving from kind of swab tests for whether or not you have got the virus or not, which is unpleasant to use and takes a long time through labs to then verify, to very swift testing, probably through saliva. So it's a kind of spit test. Therefore, you have much lower levels of false negatives and so on. So there should be high levels of reliability, very low cost, and very swift returns in 5 minutes or so. And if we had this ability for mass testing, it means to say that you could have an arrangement by which you had one or even two tests, say 5 days and one just before you go, pre-departure, which would mean to say that the event in an aeroplane and in an airport, of course, nobody there should then be with the disease. And so people can have confidence that they can travel for 2 hours or more with no concern about getting that disease from anybody else, because everybody in the plane has not got it. And then if you wish to, you can do another test of a similar kind on arrival, which will give confidence to the country where you're going that you haven't got it. So, and if it's a very low cost and very swift test, it doesn't cause queues, jams, difficulties, and so on. And therefore, that could work very well.
So if we think about the departure process, Martin, it means that somebody would, it's a bit like I feel at the airport now, I get to check in, I get through security, and you breathe a kind of sigh of relief, knowing that everybody who's that side of the security system has been screened, and presumably they haven't got through with anything unpleasant. And the same would be true with the COVID test, wouldn't it? That
It,
you could be confident that in the departure lounge and on the aircraft, you were going to be safe.
absolutely. It of course, I mean, you then have to look at it slightly wider than that. You'd have to make certain that all the airport staff and the people on the, serving in the aeroplane and the pilots and so on have also done similar tests. And I think it's true to say that it's likely that you're going to have a test before, let's say 5 days before, as well as on the day, because of the incubation period of the virus. But that's something that the scientists will finalize in their approach, I think. But the idea behind that is to give consumers confidence that it's safe to travel. And that will make a huge difference, because at the moment, there's huge levels of anxiety about traveling by aeroplane.
Like you, Martin, I obviously hope that that's going to come through fairly quickly. The problem remains, though, doesn't it, that I could book my cruise. Well, I don't be unlikely to book a cruise, but I could book my trip to India now for May next year, and then find that I have to cancel because of COVID. And that would be because I caught COVID in the meantime and was infectious. That would still be an uninsurable risk, wouldn't it? So I would not be able to avoid that element of risk.
No, and obviously it is much easier to manage if there is relatively low prevalence of the disease in the community. And at the moment, we're in a bad situation because it's rising very rapidly. So if it's at the low level, as we had really throughout Europe during the middle of the summer, that would be one which is pretty easy then to manage, because you then see that it's 0.04% or something of the people that have the virus. It's tiny numbers you're having to deal with. Of course, now it's going to be much higher. So it is much more difficult when the prevalence is high.
And that's a particular problem, isn't it, for destinations reliant on north-south? It's interesting to me, because I'm very fond of South Africa, as you know, that just as they're beginning to come out of COVID, we're going into it in a massive way. And therefore, you've got this disparity of when the infection is at its height between the originating market and the destination. That's a particular acute case, a particular acute example of that problem.
It is, but it's not just north-south. I mean, it's pretty well everywhere. I mean, the fact is that as far as we can understand, because of the very low levels of compliance, actually, of the public, particularly among the young, sadly, understandably, it's difficult, but we are going to have some level of prevalence of this virus, and it's going to vary from place to place at different times. It's going to go up and down. What I want to find is that if you have arrangement pre-departure, which are really reliable, it means to say that we are not having to have quarantine systems which are so disruptive. People are not willing to go through quarantine systems, just as they find it very difficult in the track and trace to isolate for 10 days, or however long it's necessary. So it is way of trying to reduce the impact of uncertain measures against individuals, and reduce the risk of that. The insurance risk, I think, is an interesting one, because my judgment there is that it makes sense for hotels and for airlines to think very carefully about revising during this period of COVID their cancellation arrangements, because of course they have the cancellation arrangements in place to ensure that when people make a contract, they really have done it. They've got skin in the game, so to speak.
Yes.
And therefore there are cancellation things. But in this situation, where you could find yourself just a day or two before, having made a booking 3 months before, that you can't go.
Right.
And therefore it does seem to me that, given actually the very small chance of that happening, it is a small chance, but it's important that people act responsibly, that you don't penalize them for doing it. I know that I personally have been on a plane to the US, and when I wasn't feeling well, simply because I bought the ticket and I knew that there would be huge cancellation charges, and I shouldn't have gone like that,
No,
really.
I think
And
right.
you've got to have arrangements in place, incentives in place, which will encourage people to behave responsibly. So I think airlines need to think that through quite carefully.
At the other end, of course, I'm going to get, thanks for that, Martin. At the other end, I'm going to get off the plane. I'm going to go through into somebody else's place. It would be quite understandable, wouldn't it, if there was a degree of testing on arrival, particularly for people coming from areas which are thought to have very high levels of COVID-19 and where the flight's been quite a long one. There would be some sense in testing on arrival as well as testing on departure.
Yes, I think it's probably not strictly necessary, but it would be understandable entirely if countries decided to do that, and it would give them reassurance. What we've got to have, of course, is that reciprocal arrangements going so that at each end, so it's not having just one end, it's the other end as well. So when people are in their destination, they feel safe.
Yeah.
Where they go, but also when they're going to get back on the aeroplane, they've also had the testing arrangements arranged in a similar way.
And aren't fearful that they will get trapped abroad, unable to get back because they've got COVID. And even if they've been in, I mean, there are those few cases in Italy, I think, of people who've been still got remnants of the illness, but probably aren't infectious and are now unable to get back from Italy. Those kinds of stories inevitably worry people. I know in Faversham I bumped into somebody who wants to try to get back to Botswana, and he's been stuck here for 6 months, unable to travel. Those things are really expensive if you're trapped abroad. So there's that dimension as well to worry about, I think.
Yes, I think it's interesting is that some countries have said that they will have their places for people to go if they do contract COVID and will be looked after at no cost to themselves. Yeah. And that, I think, is most helpful when that occurs. But of course, it's an expensive thing. But at the same time, the probability of having to make use of that in any significant way is very small.
And it ought, presumably, that ought, Martin, to be an insurable risk, shouldn't it? Once some kind of control over the virus has taken place.
I think it will be, indeed. But it is this, the whole underlying idea of this is kind of mass testing that needs to be available. And that's the breakthrough that we know very well that at the moment there are all these different tests which are going through assessments and evaluation at the moment and should be available in the first quarter of next year. And when we get those, it's just then the question of making certain there are enough tests, because I don't think it'll just be used for going on an aeroplane, an event of that kind, which is a very important one and will help rescue and liberate the citizens of so many different countries wishing to travel. So it'll make a colossal difference. But it'll be going to theatres and concerts and other events. People will be able to do it before they go and know that therefore they are safe to go. And if one of the undertakings of each of the event organizers is that everybody coming to that needs to have that in place, then I think it again transforms the whole feeling of a thing. So, but it relies on this idea of mass testing, which I really seriously think will emerge in a very strong way in the first quarter of next year.
Martin, thank you very much for this. It's interesting, isn't it, how much the notion of responsibility lies at the back of all that, the government, the businesses, the aviation, and the individual travellers. We're very much looking forward to your session next week, Martin, on November the 11th, when you've got a panel which you're leading on resilience and COVID-19. But for now, can I just thank you very much for that? It's been a really interesting interview, and we're all, I'm sure, looking forward to your panel next week. Thank you very much indeed, Martin.